Hi, my name's Gabrielle Brummer. I'm a student of anthropology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and today I'm here to discuss my findings on safety and segmentation during the coronavirus pandemic. So, in the United States, there hasn't been a central authority telling everyone how to respond to the pandemic. While some countries like China, Italy, or New Zealand imposed national lockdowns on all their citizens until they could get the spread of the coronavirus under control, the response of the federal government in the United States has been lax. There was the single month-long quarantine in last March. However, even during this time, there were multiple conflicting sources of information on the pandemic, just coming from within the federal government itself. People in the United States were essentially left on their own to decide who to listen to and what precautions to take to ensure their safety. In Massachusetts, where I have spent the duration of the pandemic, Governor Charlie Baker declared a state of emergency on March 23, 2020, and closed all non-essential businesses. This state of closure remained in place into mid-May, the period during which I conducted this research. While living through the pandemic myself, I have been able to engage in participant observation to monitor the behavior of people in my life, both those who I have been living with and those I have kept in close contact with via phone calls, texts, and other online communique. I have been able to observe and contextualize people's behavior in this way throughout the pandemic. And through seeing all the different measures that people are taking to protect themselves from COVID, I was able to identify two distinct understandings of safety during this crisis that were derived and adopted autonomously in a pattern that I will liken to E. Evan Pritchard's model of a segmentary lineage society. So, an initial observation that I made, which came to serve as a central framework for the rest of my research, was that people who live together in a household are sure to share germs. With a shared kitchen or bathroom space, it is almost certain that if one housemate were to become infected with the very contagious COVID-19, the rest of the people in that household would surely be exposed as well. Quarantining from a housemate thoroughly enough to protect from COVID-19 would be tedious and highly disruptive to a person's lifestyle. And therefore, I conclude that a household, whether it be a single-family home or two people living in an apartment together, represents a single unit of coronavirus response. I primarily observed the members of three different households, all in Massachusetts, which I have dubbed Households A, B, and C. Household A has 5 members, 2 parents and 3 dependents. 2 members of this household have asthma, and 2 have chronic illness, which contribute to immunodeficiency. Both adults have office jobs, which they were able to maintain remotely during the pandemic. Household B only has 4 members, 2 adults and 2 dependents. They are all currently in good health. The main income of this household is a woodworking shop, privately owned by the parents. And the production of the shop has suffered greatly since the lockdown. Household C has 5 members, 2 teenagers, their parents, and their paternal grandmother, who is a senior citizen and at increased risk from coronavirus. This household has a primary breadwinner who was also able to maintain his office job remotely during the statewide lockdown. Even though all 3 of these households are in the same state, even within the same 10-mile radius, and all under the authority of the same government, I observed them taking vastly different precautions that pointed to keep them safe from the pandemic, that actually pointed to vastly different understandings of what it meant to be safe from the pandemic, that in the absence of a single authority, they had derived on their own. The way that people derive an understanding of safety is through a binary opposition with unsafety. Binary oppositions are 2 concepts that are inherent opposites as defined and can be contrasted against each other, which an example of this would be we as humans understand what is morally right because we understand what is morally wrong, and vice versa. Right and wrong are binary oppositions, and by contrasting them against each other, we gain a better understanding of both. In this case, I have identified two main binary oppositions that people utilize to understand safety versus unsafety in the time of coronavirus: clean versus unclean, and undiseased versus diseased. The former binary opposition, clean versus unclean, is based on the idea that only entities which are known to have no exposure from the coronavirus, perhaps because they have been fully quarantined, thoroughly quarantined for an amount of time, can be considered clean and therefore safe. All else, all which is unknown, is considered unclean and unsafe by default. In the latter binary opposition, undiseased versus diseased, all things which are diseased, all peoples and things which are infected, carrying, and capable of transmitting coronavirus are unsafe. All else, then, by default, can be considered undiseased and therefore safe. Obviously, these two different understandings of safety can lead to vastly different measures taken to protect against coronavirus. Household A, which adheres to the clean versus unclean model, had one of the teenage dependents working at a restaurant when the lockdown was announced in Massachusetts. The parents of this household asked that the teenager quit this job, as every day they would come in contact with both customers and coworkers who would be considered unknown variables. They were potential carriers of coronavirus and were, by default, considered unclean and dangerous. And the teenager quit this job in order to quarantine during the pandemic. This was obviously able to be done because both of the parents were able to work remotely, and they wanted to prioritize those who had immunodeficiencies within their household. In household B, which adheres to the undiseased versus disease model of safety, one of the teenagers was also working outside of the home when the lockdown was announced, except he continued working at his job. In early April, 3 of his coworkers were diagnosed with coronavirus. However, he and the rest of his coworkers tested negative. Once everybody had been tested and the infected coworkers had gone into quarantine and stopped coming to work, Household B deemed it safe for him too to return to work. He did not have the virus, and the people who did have the virus, the people who were considered diseased and therefore unsafe, had been weeded out and removed. Therefore, his work was once again considered undiseased and safe. We can see how this definition serves to fit a very different need. It allows people far more flexibility, which can allow them to fill their financial and social needs during this time of crisis. And obviously, each household exists autonomously and is able to choose on their own which definition of safety they want to adopt and what measures to take to ensure this safety. However, just because each household is capable of choosing on their own authority autonomously which definition of safety to adopt does not mean that they are isolated inherently. No matter which definition of safety that a household adheres to, I observed them working to maintain social links with people in other households. For instance, those who can decide on a common conception of safety and even who can agree on taking the same quarantining measures or precautions can form a larger pod of multiple households, a community in which they can feel safe with the other people, even though they are not all part of the same household. This pattern of organization is similar to that found in E. Evan Pritchard's model of a segmentary society or segmentary lineage system. This is a system found in foraging societies where people live in bands, often kinship groups, that are fairly mobile, exist autonomously, and have little social hierarchy. The band can exist on their own, but often several will choose to come together and cohabitate, based on a set of agreed upon rules and shared values. They join together to form a larger community. And they do this for the same reason that we today like to be part of communities: mutual support, more food, companionship. And of course, the creation of a larger unit does not necessarily undercut the autonomy of any one group. These communities, according to Evan Pritchard's model, can fracture because of an argument or a change in circumstance like food availability. After a few months or years or generations, the cohabitation of various groups can end, and different kinships groups will split off and go their own ways to do what's best for their members. These societies are dynamic, but ultimately we see the same tendency in these people as we see in the people living through the pandemic today: our desire to socialize and be together. Without a central authority in the United States, people have been forced to come up with their own conceptions of safety. And in doing so, people consider not only their physical health, but meeting their financial and social needs as well. And while the pandemic has kept us apart in many ways, it has also required us to create new communities and new perceptions of comprehension of our world. And that's not to say that the pandemic or the lack of organization on the and the level of the United States federal government in response to the pandemic were good in any way. But it is, in my opinion, it's heartening to see the way that people have been able to react and adapt and grow and support each other throughout this crisis. Thank you.